unmute myself because it will normally.
And folks that are on, feel free to go to that tiny URL for the UDL reporting criteria. It's not necessary, but it's there if you'd like to take a look at it. We'll be referencing it.
Okay, we are live on YouTube, and I'm going to go ahead and start recording.
Tell us when you get started, Mackenzie.
We are good to go. We have 8 attendees, and I know there's lots more registered, so if you want to go ahead and get started, you're more than welcome to, or you can hang on just one more minute and give people a second to log on.
Well, Kavita, George, and Chris, what should we do?
Let's just wait a minute, just in case people are
all right
frantically coming on. We don't want to, I see more people popping in.
Well, 1 minute warning for those folks popping in.
Get in fast. We need some opening music or something like that.
We should, yes. Maybe Mackenzie could sing for us.
Yep, not going to happen.
Don's going to sing It's the Final Countdown.
Oh, there you go.
Don, if we put you on mic, will you sing for us? He said no. Darn. He would DJ. All right. Now I know who to get at the beginning of my future webinars. Okay, so I think we've got a minute. You want to get started, Sean?
Sure, let's get started. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I know we're all sorts of different places and time zones, and some people are even in tomorrow. So welcome to a webinar here with the UDL IRN. I'm going to facilitate the first several slides, and then the rest of the group, Kavita, George, and Christine would join us. We're going to be on several different locations. Of course, we're in the Google Doc for feedback. You can chat along as well. That's at the bottom of your screen. We're live streaming, as some of us already know, on YouTube. And of course, we're tweeting there at the IRN sign there. So feel free to interact with us in several different ways. And Mackenzie and Kavita and others will be monitoring these different components, and we'll be trying to respond as things go along. Kavita, you're controlling the slides, right?
Yep, I got it. Sorry.
Okay.
Playing with this here. Okay, got it.
Great. So what we're going to focus on today will be some reporting criteria that we had a URL for just a moment ago, and we'll get to in just another moment. This is available via the UDL IRN website under the research pages. It's been available for a little bit, and there's the URL again. The reporting criteria is available, and again, we're going to kind of walk through the process today of what we did over a series of several months, both on-site as well as virtual. And that's kind of our focus, is to kind of walk you through elements of the criteria, give you a little exposure to it, give you a little practice with it, and kind of give you not only the background, but where we are and hopefully where we're going with this criteria to move UDL forward in terms of further implementation and understanding. The folks that were involved with the development, most of us are here, and actually we'll let everyone say hello if you would. So Kavita, why don't you start, and we'll kind of go across the screen saying hello.
Okay, hi everybody, I'm Kavita Rao. I'm a professor at the University of Hawaii. I see some familiar names on our attendee list, so welcome and thanks for being here.
Hi, I'm George Van Horn. I'm the Director of Special Education with Bartholomew Consolidated School Corporation in Columbus, Indiana.
And I'm Chris Grimer-Farrell from Australia. I have a dual role. I'm an honorary professor at UNSW, and I'm also leading special education and diverse learning needs for across a New South Wales school sector.
I just wanted to say that Dave Edinburgh is traveling internationally, so he couldn't be with us today. And Shira is in Israel, and it's 3 a.m. her time. So she said she's sorry, but she's fast asleep. So, but they are integral to the development of this. So this is the whole group that was involved in developing these criteria.
And let's tell you a little bit about that. So first of all, my name is Sean Smith. I'm a faculty member at the University of Kansas and was there at the first meeting when the IRN got started in Chicago several years back with George and several others. As we move forward within the IRN, the research group, of course, has been doing a number of things. And back at a pre-conference in March of 2017 in Orlando, we got together a group. We actually got several groups together. And from the different groups, a different product originated. And from our group, we focused in on this idea of how do we determine universal design for learning within the literature. And so that's very, very basic. And Kavita will take on in just a moment. But our focus here was, how does UDL practice? How is it applied to practice? What's a UDL-based lesson? And the application was some researchers, practitioners, and our group, as you can see, is represented from that. From that, we developed the criteria through a number of different elements, which we'll describe. And of course, we created it in terms of outcomes for the website for use. And we'll refer to some work we've been doing with it for further understanding based on overall scholarship. So that's just a bit of a tip of the iceberg. Kavita will get into the details here right now.
Okay, thanks, Sean. So when we convened in March 2017, over a year ago in Orlando, our work group, the 6 of us, talked about what do we know about UDL and what are some things we need to know? What are some important priorities that we have? So we discussed the fact that we know that when CAS developed UDL, they were based on research evidence. So the checkpoints of UDL, those 31 checkpoints and the guidelines are based on evidence-based, evidence-based. And if you go to CAS website, you can click on each checkpoint and see what research the checkpoints come from. So we know that it was developed with a research base. But in the past 2 decades, researchers have also been trying to establish, how do you use this framework? What is the research behind using the whole framework towards practices, not just the individual checkpoints? So when we talked about the literature that exists, what we find is that people describe their use of UDL in different ways. Some people will say, I'm using UDL, I'm using the principles of UDL at the beginning of an article, and then not really enumerate what they did. Other researchers will go into great detail. Some people will tell you how they're using UDL in one part, but not another. So as we talked about this base that was there, our group discussed the fact that it would be good to have some consistency in how people report on their use of UDL. And if we can have some consistency, we can start looking at what effective applications are across different reporting, different articles, different things that people report out on. We might be able to find some effective implementation models for classrooms, for schools, for districts. So that was kind of the initial discussion that we started having when we met in March. And the group came up with kind of, this was what we wanted to do with we decided to spend a year working on this. And we wanted to we actually wanted to come up with some criteria or guidelines to make a UDL claim. And I want to attribute those words to Dave Edinburgh because it's something he's been saying for many years. It's in his article, his seminal article from 2011, the 10 propositions of UDL that many of us are familiar with. He talks about the fact that to make a UDL claim, we need to have some common things present. So we thought, well, it would be nice to have some basis for making a UDL claim. Our group also discussed that we wanted this to be useful both for reporting on a UDL intervention or a practice, but also for designing. So whether you're actually writing an article or a report, or you are designing a study or an intervention, it would be useful to know what should be in there. And then the third thing that our group felt strongly about was we didn't want it to be just something for researchers to do. We wanted it to be useful for researchers and practitioners. So as we developed it, we really focused on how to make the wording relevant for several groups and stakeholders. And then after the Orlando meeting, we met online almost monthly for several months, for 6 or 7 months. That was quite a feat because we were to find a time that works for everybody from Hawaii to Australia to Israel to the continental US was quite a feat, but we did it. We met several times over Zoom. And then we went through kind of a systematic process to develop them. First, we looked at different types of criteria and standards in related fields like the health professions. We looked at the Starlight standards, the PRISMA standards for meta-analyses and systematic reviews, the CEC quality indicators. So we looked at all of these to get an idea of the types of formats and structures that people use for these kind of guidelines, and then talk about what types of, what we wanted to do with ours. After we looked at that, we came up with some objectives for the UDL RCs that we were developing. And we decided that what we wanted them to do was define the essential elements of UDL, provide a set of guidelines, and support clear reporting. And the most important point that I want to make here is that our group felt really strongly that we didn't want to come up with a set of standards or quality indicators. We didn't want to tell people what to do. We were not interested in saying this is good or this is bad. That was not at all our intention. The intention was just to lay out some basic things that need to be present when you say you're doing UDL or applying UDL or using UDL. We wanted guidelines that just had people define a few factors of what that means. So we also wanted to honor the inherent flexibility of UDL. The way CAST has developed the UDL framework, it is a very flexible instructional design framework that can be used for many purposes. It can be used for K through 12, higher education, adult learning. It can be used in various settings for different types of learners. So we liked that flexibility. So we wanted the wording to remain flexible so that no matter who you are, how you want to use UDL, you can. So we just wanted some common things that you would tell us about how you're using UDL. So that was an important piece of what we wanted to do. So based on that, we came up with 3 guiding tenets for the UDL reporting criteria. You can actually find these on the document. If you've downloaded and printed it, it's on page 2 of the UDL reporting criteria. We put it right up front. The 3 things that were really important: we wanted to keep it simple. When we looked at all the other guidelines, there are some that are very detailed. They go into a lot of things that you can rate. We decided keeping it simple makes sense because people are more likely to use it if it's simple. So we came up with 3 main categories with only 2 to 3 criteria per category. And so it's basically just over a page long, hopefully easy to use and appealing to use. We also wanted to keep it essential. So the thing with UDL is it means so many things to so many people. So we did not want to try to have Sean's lens or Chris's lens or my lens or George's lens on UDL. We wanted to focus on some of the essential things that all of us can agree are part of UDL. So we'll talk a little on the next slide about what those are. And then the third thing, we wanted these to be non-evaluative. And that goes back to the thing about we weren't trying to establish standards. We're not trying to evaluate whether someone is using UDL well or badly or too much or too little. That was not our purpose. When you look at our criteria, it's just a yes/no rating. Is it there or is it not there? We did recognize that there are people who are going to use the criteria who do want to make quality assessment. So they're welcome to. There's a notes column. So if you wanted to add a layer of looking at how much UDL is used or how many checkpoints are used or how somebody did it or if engagement is addressed, you can add a layer to the report, whatever you're looking at by using the notes column. So we wanted to be clear that we were not looking for any amount of UDL. We're not looking for people to use a certain number of checkpoints. You can use the ones that make sense for whatever you're doing. So this is some of the contextual features of the reporting criteria. So again, here's the URL. We've already put that up. I'm just putting this up in case you came in after the beginning. If you will go to this, we're going to be using these for the next few slides to do a little activity.
It's also available over in the chat window. There's a link that Mackenzie put in there that you can just click on it and go right there.
Thanks, Sean. So before we start using it, I just wanted to go over those 3 categories and the 2 or 3 criteria per category and how we came up with them. So if you look at number 1 and 2, learner variability and environment and proactive and intentional design, those are those essential elements of UDL that I think pretty much everybody in the UDL field will agree that learner variability is a really important facet of using UDL. Proactive and intentional design, that's in CAST's work, that's in UDL theory and practice, the book. if you read the literature on UDL, there's pretty much agreement on the field that those are characteristics of UDL. So those were the two categories that we thought everyone could agree on. And under each category, we came up with some criteria that we recommend that people address. Who are the participants of whatever you're doing? Give us some information about them. Tell us about the setting in relation to UDL. What kind of classroom is it? What kind of school setting is it? Number two is the interesting and kind of tricky one. So 2A and 2B are somewhat abstract concepts because there are so many ways that people address barriers, and there are so many ways that people conceive of increasing access. And similarly for B, what variability is and how people address variability there's a lot of variability in that. So those were tricky ones to write. And if you read the descriptions in 2A and 2B, we tried to keep it broad enough that no matter how somebody conceptualizes it, they might be meeting those two criteria. Again, we didn't want to specify what you should be saying about those two things, just that you were saying something about those two things. We even put for 2A that you don't have to use the word barriers, you don't have to use the word access, as long as you're addressing those things in whatever terminology you use. That's what we're hoping would be in a UDL reporting or a study or something that you write. And then finally, number 3 is describing what was UDL about that thing that was implemented. What were the components? What were the UDL components? When you're reporting on the outcomes of a study, many times people will tell you that something worked, this practice worked, but they may not go and say, what UDL components do you think actually worked? So we're hoping people will be a little more clear about what aspects of UDL worked if you say that something worked. So without further ado, let's try using these. I think it'll make a little more sense when you actually apply them to some articles. So what we've done is we took excerpts from 3 different articles so that you could apply these different criteria and see if you can find some of these factors. So if everybody could take a moment and go to this tiny URL here. And Mackenzie is going to put that in the chat box. That's the examples-UDLRC.
Yeah, it's there now, folks.
Okay, and I'm going to share my document. You can go to the document, but I'll also share my screen so that you can see it. So when you go to this, go to example number 1. I'll give everybody a chance.
Several of us are there. That's good.
Okay, I think I see a lot of people on it, and I also shared it in case you're not able to get onto the Google Doc, you can see it shared on my screen. So take this first example, and I just pulled out one of the criteria. Usually you would apply all of them to an article. I just pulled out a small excerpt from an article, and take a minute to skim page 1 and see if how did these authors address variability? Take a moment, and we'll discuss it in a moment. So once you're done taking a look at that and considering that, how have authors described aspects of design that address variability? This can include a description of how flexibility, choice, or engagement is addressed in this practice or intervention. If you have, you can type in the chat box if you see some examples of how they've done this, how these authors have done this. We're also going to try to have you all speak. So Mackenzie's going to help with this. If you have a comment you'd like to make about this, if you'll use your hand raise function, Mackenzie can magically make your microphone work, we believe. So
yes, I believe there should be a feature at the bottom of the Zoom window that you have pulled up that allows you to raise your hand. So we have one right now. So so I'm going to allow you to talk. Okay. You are muted, but you are permitted to talk. MB727. I don't know who that is. I can also unmute you. We might not. If you don't have a microphone hooked up, it might not work as well.
Oh, I have a mic. Interesting. No, I guess it's not going to work.
Meanwhile, if anybody wants to type in the chat box, you can as well.
Okay.
Oh, I think we can hear you actually.
Yeah, we can. Go ahead, talk. I think we can hear you.
Me?
Yes.
Oh, I was
Yes.
just thinking the text to speech is talked about, correct?
Right.
Text highlighting, the changing font size and contrast.
Yes, excellent. So that when we were rating this study, this is one of the exemplars where this is addressed. We felt like they gave very specific examples of the flexibility that they were providing within the intervention. So that would rate as a yes. So perfect. Those are exactly the kinds of things we're looking for. So did somebody else raise their hand? I heard a ping. Mackenzie?
Nope. She was the only one.
And we've got Ruby saying dictionary, multimedia, and glossary. Right, so this is great. You folks are finding the things that people have said, and this is really rich. I picked one that had so many examples of how flexibility was addressed. These authors, this is Tracy Hall and her colleagues from CAST, they really explain a lot about how they're addressing variability through their intervention. They actually goes on beyond this. I just cut and paste a little bit so that we weren't reading for a long time. But this would be an example of really a lot of the variability is addressed here. How they're addressing variability is addressed in this example. Let's go to example number 2, which is on page 2, and we're going to take a look at another checkpoint. Another criteria, which is 2C. And this one is looking for authors providing details about how and which of the 9 UDL guidelines or the 31 checkpoints are applied. And they can do this however they want. They can talk about goals, assessments, methods, or materials. So take a quick skim of this excerpt from an article and tell us what you think. Does it meet or not meet, and why?
Okay, it looks like John raised his hand, so I'm going to allow him to talk. All right, John, you are permitted to talk, but it looks like you're muted.
Okay, am I live now?
Yep, there you go.
Hey!
Hey, Don.
I love this article. I use it in my classes. So I think they did a great job being really specific down into the checkpoints, which I've tried to do at different points and been told that I'm getting too into the weeds before. So I like the direction. One, I love what they did here, but I also really like the direction that you've taken this. So I think this is a good example of how they're specifically referencing individual checkpoints and providing a lot of clarity.
Great. And Don, now you have ammunition to say, look, I'm supposed to do this. These reporting criteria tell me to put these checkpoints in, right?
God bless you.
Right. So thanks, Don. Yeah. So these authors, again, it's kind of an exemplar. They go above and beyond. They connect the checkpoints to very specific parts of their intervention. And again, I just want to clarify, we're not expecting people to be this detailed. Like some authors may not, their intervention may not, or their practice may not lend itself to being this detailed. They might have 3 things that they connect. That's totally fine. What we're looking for is that people are making a specific connection though. Another important point here is that we were looking for connections to the UDL guidelines. That's the 9 guidelines or the 31 checkpoints. The reason we said that is because many of the older articles talk about the 3 principles of UDL. They'll say we use multiple means of representation or we use multiple means of engagement. That's okay, and that's good that they say that, but it's so broad that it's sometimes hard to know what they did for multiple means of representation or engagement. So we felt like giving guideline level information or checkpoint level information starts to build our knowledge of models that work. So that's why we suggest that. Sean?
And we also want to reinforce, although, and I know it's been said, but we're not looking for manuscript articles that actually, as this one did, put in parentheses, okay, this is what we're trying to do, and this is in reference to UDL, this checkpoint or this guideline. That's not necessary. I want to make sure that we understand and appreciate that.
Yes, and thanks, Sean. You reminded me. So how people do it can be different. There are some authors who'll make a table and they'll list everything in a table and how it connects. There are some authors who'll embed it. Some will write it out differently. So again, we weren't being specific about how it's done as long as it is done. So that said, let's go to number 3. And Dawn, I'm so excited that you're here because we pulled something from an article of yours. So this one, we're going to 3B, which is in addition to describing the overall outcomes of an intervention, the authors describe UDL components in relation to their learners and what happened in the intervention. So read this excerpt and maybe give us some examples of how the authors did this. Anybody want to wager some comments on whether these authors meet 3B and why and how?
Well, one comment there in the chat window about the podcast.
Right. They make a very specific connection to components of the intervention, which is a podcast, to the results of what happened for students.
Does the author offer any commentary?
What's that?
Does the author want to offer any commentary?
Yeah, Don, do you want to jump in?
All right, Don.
Okay. Sorry, I've been unmuted. I'm muted myself again, I think. Yeah, I kind of wish I had done what Marino et al. Did and just actually put in the little things, but I was actually, I was thinking about this particular one as I was talking about it. This is one of the ones I think I was into the weeds a little bit. So I think one of the things I really liked about it was I thought we did a nice job of providing options for executive function, which I don't feel like I see as much in the literature sometimes. And, students get a chance to use advanced test taking strategies, like coming back with a podcast, you can come back to the question, you can skip question 5 and move on to question 6, or listen to it 3 or 4 times. Whereas teacher read aloud, everyone goes at the pace of the slowest student generally for each question.
So this is great. So the thing that Don's group did when they wrote this is really be clear which part of the results, which of their study and their intervention, which UDL components seem to work for the students. And that's helpful for us to know as a field, because if they had just said, oh yeah, the podcasts work, that's great. We know they work, but it's also helpful for us to know what works, because if we're replicating this or we're doing something similar, we know which components of the study the authors feel were useful or workable. So other thing I wanted to point out that I thought was kind of a nice contrast to Marino's study is you notice that Don and his colleagues don't put the checkpoint numbers in here. So, and that's fine, where you don't have to put the numbers in as long as you're using the wording. So they're saying things like options for executive function, options to support planning and strategy development. Those are the terms from the UDL framework. So that's great because we know what they're talking about. So we wanted to be clear that, again, we're being non-prescriptive. They don't have to do something in an exact way as long as they're referencing the UDL framework clearly.
Yep, and it looks like Don wants to chime in on that as well.
Just a quick question, and I have to actually run here in a second, so I just wanted to get my question in, and maybe you'll cover it again in a second. But what if at some point in the future, I want to look at just one specific checkpoint and go deep? As long as I'm clearly referencing it, would that still be, my concern sometimes is when we get very discrete on a specific intervention, it can feel like, is this UDL enough? If that makes sense.
So I'll jump in on that, and then I'll let everybody else chime in. My feeling on that is that's a design question. So if you're addressing whatever barriers or the variability with that one checkpoint, then that's what you're doing. So I guess that's again my personal opinion, that we're not prescriptive about which checkpoints to use or how many. So that, anybody else want to chime in on Don's question there?
Well, certainly. I think if you take a look at the reporting criteria, what Kavita mentioned is a key component in terms of the beginning. It's the barriers and the variability are an element, including then what part of UDL. So you do not, and you went finite with your question, Don, but that's, I think, a question amongst the field is, wait a minute here. So I'm doing one of three principles, or I'm doing two or three, or I'm just doing a guideline. And that is very appropriate. I think that was very much part of the consideration of the reporting criteria as we considered kind of the ins and outs, that yes, you would be able to do that as long as some of those other elements are considered when you take a look at especially the beginning part of the criteria. So.
Yeah, and I think one of the concerns we had as a group was this question keeps coming up. Do I have to use a checkpoint from every column? Do I have to use 2 checkpoints from every column? And we wanted to emphasize that there's no quantity, or you don't have to quantify how many have to be from anywhere, how many you have to use. Some people say it's not UDL if you don't use all 31. So again, we were trying to dispel all of those ideas that there has to be a certain quantity or amount. And we wrote the criteria to allow you to use 1 if that is what works for your intervention. So I hope that kind of answers your question, Don. And for everybody here, if you have thoughts or comments on the wording of these criteria or questions, please do use our feedback form and write it up, because we'll be looking to revise these and refine these with feedback from the field. So we would love anything you have to say around this. Even if you think of it later, our Google Doc will be up, and we would love any kind of feedback you have on these little details.
Hey, Kavita, can I just jump in as a practitioner and answer that question?
Sure.
If you're very honed in and focused on one checkpoint, but addressing 1 or 2 or 3 of these criteria, as a practitioner, that's actually very helpful, because you're basically giving us something really specific that we can then take and actually utilize in the schools. So again, looking at the sort of the 3 headings in terms of variability, the intentional design, and the implementation and outcomes, if you're addressing that through a checkpoint, that's going to be very helpful. Because sometimes it's a little pie in the sky-ish. Now, you could get too deep into it with the checkpoints. You'd have to be careful, but I think it'd be useful.
So George, I'm going to skip the next slide and give it to you just so we can get your perspective, since you got started on that. And then I'll go back to that slide. Do you want to tell us a little more about using it from a practitioner's lens?
Sure. I wasn't intending to have you jump me, but that's okay. One of the things that I was most excited about was being asked to participate in the work group. And when I was talking with some of our district leadership, our superintendent said, "Why are you going to participate in a committee and a work group with a group of researchers? And you're a practitioner." And so we talked quite a bit about that, and how exciting it was that a group of researchers actually wanted to have a practitioner involved and get a different point of view on what was useful. And again, sometimes those of us in the field might have a different definition of useful than some of the academics. Look at the look on Sean's face. But I think in the end, it was really kind of neat, because as we talked through these and came up with these 3 bigger pieces of criteria, and we actually all agreed, when we're looking at the implementation of UDL, one of the first things we look at is the learning environment and the acceptance of variability. So seeing that in a research article or in research that's conducted is really helpful for us to know, okay, this is about the bigger picture. This is about variability, and that's kind of a core component for us for UDL. And then looking at those things that help us address barriers and then create options, which is written here as increasing access. Again, a very, very helpful piece for all of us. So, and jumping down to the findings, that's something we've been really looking at for a long time, is so what? So we think we're utilizing the UDL framework to design our learning environments and to design our instruction, but what's really happening with students? And so when we look at data and see the improvements in the various, test scores and local assessments and all the other kinds of things, and are able to go back and really connect it to sort of our sort of singular focus on making sure UDL drives all our work, that helps us. So then to be able to go and look at research and look at articles and be able to sort of analyze those articles using the same criteria that we analyze our own daily work with, really brings research and practice together, which is my thinking, and the purpose of research is to improve practice. So the criteria for looking at research is basically the same criteria we use to look at the practical application or utilization of UDL. So it blends very nicely, and which I think is really cool, that we have university and practitioners working together, and we end up starting at our own points, kind of talking about it and coming to the same conclusion. And just a little side note, this isn't really a practitioner one, but I wrote myself a little note because earlier on, I think somebody mentioned something about where UDL is utilized, but we do a lot of work in our community, particularly with our businesses. And we now have our businesses looking at UDL, and these criteria are the same kinds of things we're talking with our businesses like Cummins and other businesses in the community about, is that they have worker variability, and they need to look at their learning environment, which is our work environment, and their design of their world and how they evaluate success also has to connect here. So we're seeing even a bigger connection from research to practitioner in schools to now into our community and our business world. So I think it just really lends some credibility to the criteria that this group came up with. Now I'll be quiet.
No, thanks, George. This is actually great information to share, because as you said, you were sitting in a group full of academics and we sometimes went deep into the weeds. So it was great to have George pull us back out into the practical aspects. Chris, I'm going to hand it over to you so you can tell us a little bit about this in the UDL reporting criteria in your context.
Okay, thank you. I've kept it quite broad, and I'm trying to come and hit that research to practice relevance for us in terms of the Australian context, where we've got a very big Commonwealth move on national consistent collection of data, where it has to be empirically based research practices that are implemented in schools. So the importance of having quality research design that's accessible and understood by all practitioners is really quite paramount. That's continued that conversation that's gone on and on and on, where, we've worked with incredibly great teachers who have said, we read all about this research and often it doesn't find its way into our classrooms because some of these researchers are so far removed from the contextual realities of crowded curriculum, etc. Then I've worked with fantastic researchers who say, we put all of this effort into publishing all this quality research to improve practice, but I can't understand why it's not being implemented in our classroom context. So it's that notion of crossing the divide, when the irony is both researchers and practitioners are all saying the same thing. We want to motivate student engagement and success by breaking down barriers. And so the reporting criteria, I think, is quite attractive in that it's quite accessible in terms of it helps the research design impact and guide effective practice that's accessible to practitioners as well as researchers. And its core is on that notion of learner variability, and where learner variability and intentional design meet to really have its greatest impact on, on the teachers and the classroom practice where we're actually moving toward. And it's done that through that really clear, consistent quality research criteria that's there in the reporting criteria. Because essentially we're all kind of striving to the same thing. And as George said, the purpose of research is to improve practice, but then it's the research within classrooms that actually, the practice within classrooms also informs research. So I see it as a cyclic thing. The other thing that I think that the reporting criteria is helpful in is that it's got a really explicit use of language. From my perspective, what I find is that some notions of like words like inclusion can mean one thing to one particular school of people or one group of people, yet it's quite loosely interpreted in another group. So the explicit use of language that can be interpreted with great clarity in terms of the reporting criteria, I think is fantastic. And I've got those two pictures in there because I was asked to look at the perspectives from the field, and I'm seeing increasingly that the research and the practice domains are actually getting closer through that notion of collaboration. And I actually also believe that although that we can look at the three individual sections as individual sections, I do also think that I suppose the whole in its entirety for practice over the duration of a year is greater than the sum of the equal parts. So although we, from the research perspective, we actually, it's really beneficial to unpack different elements, I think that when it all comes together, we really do see significant gains in terms of the practical implementation of the essence of research. So I'm hoping that kind of makes sense in terms of where we're going within Australia. The criteria, reporting criteria, is actually building a collective approach in terms of the use of language. It's almost like a segue in terms of where research is going. It's providing that consistency in approach so that practitioners can know what to look for, and the researchers have got a guiding framework that they can work to that will hopefully increase traction and volume within the field of both practice and research.
Okay, great, Chris. That's wonderful. I think you're bringing together kind of the fact that we need consistency so that both groups know what we're talking about and what UDL is. And you actually gave me the best segue back to the slide I skipped when I jumped over to George. So one of the things we found, so Chris brought up the language piece, which was really important. It wasn't easy to come up with the language of these criteria either, because do we use inclusion? What does the word inclusion mean? Do we use the word barriers? What does barriers mean? So we had to be really careful in using wording that would be meaningful to everybody. But it's the reality is, if all of us here, all 18 of us present here tried to use this, we would have slightly different interpretations. So one of the things, a group of 4 of us used these criteria on a set of about 21 articles this summer just to see what happened with our interpretations. And I just wanted to give you some examples of ways that we used them independently and came together to discuss interpretations. So for example, with 2A, addressing barriers, a couple of the people rating the articles were asked, well, if they don't address specific barriers for specific students, do we rate them as yes? And we decided as a group that yes, because UDL is not necessarily about barriers for specific students, it can be for a group as well. So we found that we had to kind of discuss our interpretations as a group. So if any of you are using these criteria with several people to rate, there definitely needs to be some inner rating and understanding the criteria together. Another example I'll give you is 2C. So looking at the application of UDL guidelines and checkpoints, that one seems easy because you either use those guidelines and checkpoints or not. And it's pretty easy to find if people have them. But then we found another variation that people do. We found a few articles where people kind of vaguely use the terminology of the checkpoints, but it's a little bit of a mashup. There's like one checkpoint terminology mashed up with the second one. And we decided that's a no, because the vagueness is what has made the UDL research base a little bit hard to compile. So we decided, as in our group of 4 for the articles that we were rating, that people had to be specific to the checkpoints or guidelines as defined by CAST. So use the CAST wording. And then the last one was really interesting. When you're looking at 3A and 3B, we wanted people to talk about UDL in relation to the outcomes of whatever they were doing. And couple of us in the group, a couple of people said, well, they described some of their outcomes in relation to UDL, but not all. So is that a yes or no? So then we discussed as a group that the reality is sometimes you're doing a practice and not everything about that practice has a UDL outcome. So for example, you might be looking something that has an academic and behavioral outcome. And let's say that just in theory, you applied UDL to an academic piece. So you only need to report on UDL in a way that's relevant. You don't have to report on it for every outcome, but the outcomes that are UDL related. So again, I wanted to highlight that there are interpretational things with the wording that if you're using them, you might want to talk with others who use them. And again, I wanted to highlight the flexibility. We're not trying to make this a rigid document. We wanted it to be flexible enough that it works for all different people using the document.
And Kavita, if I could just offer a piggyback on that. One, the individuals that were involved with it, and I was one, I'd have to say are folks that have been around UDL for a while. And so it was interesting in terms of the conversation that followed. And two, I just want to reinforce that flexibility, not only in the literature, but also how potentially, at least we're trying to use this criteria, we try to design it with a manner that allows for that flexibility for that conversation. So I hope you are engaging with other colleagues if you start to use this, because I think you'll find a lot of conversation. So thank you.
And one thing we would appreciate, if you're looking through the wording of these criteria, those of you who are joining us on the webinar or out there in the YouTube live stream, and you see things about the wording that you'd like to give us feedback on, we would love the feedback. This is not a document that we hope to update it, and we hope to get feedback from you all in the field. So please do use the Google Doc that we have for feedback. Mackenzie, if you can put that link in the chat box, I'd appreciate it, because we will be reviewing that now and later to see if people say, oh, that word really bugs me, I don't know what that means. Let us know, because again, as Sean mentioned, most of us were very familiar with UDL. So sometimes we might miss some definitional things that others in the field would like defined better or further. Okay, so to wrap up, I just kind of want to bring home the point that we made these criteria for many different groups, researchers, practitioners, and also for journal editors. And this goes back to what Dawn was saying. Sometimes people will say, you're saying too much, you're not saying enough. But the criteria can also give people who are editing journals and they get articles, they might say, you need to say what is UDL about your intervention. And the reporting criteria will give the journal editor some teeth on what needs to be said. It gives researchers clarity on what to address in a manuscript and how to design a study. And it lets practitioners know what is UDL about things being done. So again, we are hoping that it will be useful broadly across the field.
And our hope also, the next steps of the reporting criteria is that we'll get input, as Kavita was just mentioning, from users, from folks that actually would utilize it. It's there on the IRN website. Hopefully, spread the word. It's been there for a little bit. But as folks are using it, and the expectation of their use, feedback would be just tremendous. And potential, not only use, but also application of use, how they're using it, potentially different directions of how people are beginning to use it. Again, we've been thinking of the stakeholders. Of course, we had a variety of stakeholders that actually helped develop it. But again, I think the more use, potentially more interpretation, more adjustments. So very open to that, and very open to, hopefully we've started a conversation that might continue and further adjust. So, and we know some colleagues out there that were just chomping at the bit to be able to get a hold of this, and we're waiting for them to use it and give us feedback, because different perspectives will be very much welcome.
Chris and George, do you want to add anything more as we wrap up about the criteria?
I think the process in which it was evolved was quite comprehensive, and I think that it also reflects the flexibility, which hopefully then, I suppose, portrays its usage as well. So very open to additional feedback in terms of allowing that growth to continue.
Yeah, I would basically reiterate everything that's just been said. The development, and this is a sick thing, was really a fun process. We had some good debates. We had good information sharing. It was a lot of time, and it was absolutely well worth it. And I would encourage the folks who are participating and others is to make sure you share this reporting criteria with school districts. Okay, and get feedback on what do they think. Is this a useful way to sort of guide some research that'll help us? So those of you who are in Kansas and Hawaii and other universities, put it out to some practitioners and get their feedback and see what they think, because they're the implementers. So I think their voice is important. And for the university folks, run it by some of your students in some of your classes. see what they're thinking about it, and be open to their feedback.
Okay, we're going to hang around for some questions, but before we take your questions, I just wanted to thank UDL IRN has been tremendous in supporting our group to come together. We are part of the research committee of the UDL IRN, so I wanted to thank the IRN and also Mackenzie, who's like this magical person in the background who makes everything really smooth. So thank you, Mackenzie, for helping make this happen. She uploads new versions in a minute. Like if we make a change on this, she's got it up in like 5 minutes. So thank you for your support. And I just wanted to shout out, Mackenzie wanted me to, well, actually, Mackenzie, you're here. So do you want to just talk about the summit real quickly and then we'll take questions?
Absolutely. That would be great. So we have our UDL IRN Summit this upcoming March, the 27th through the 29th. Early bird tickets are going to be pulled down this upcoming December 5th. That's next Wednesday. So make sure to buy your early bird tickets now. And hopefully we'll have a great schedule put together for you by January. So look for that as well.
Great location, folks.
Yep, Orlando, Florida.
All right, and with that, we're kind of done with the official talking at you piece. If we'd love questions and feedback and comments, so we're going to hang around. If there's anything you'd like to add or ask.
I'm going to throw one more thank you in, and absolutely agree 1,000,000% about Mackenzie. She makes us look really good. But Kavita, you did a marvelous job pulling this all together. Not just tonight, but the whole process. You have been the person who's done most of the work, and we get to smile. So I really do thank you for everything that you've done.
Thank you, George. It's very nice.
Yeah, I echo that.
I do too. Thanks, Kavita.
Looks like we're losing viewers.
Yep. And I did notice somebody posted something about using the criteria in Sheboygan Falls in Wisconsin. So we'll be anxious to hear their feedback. I just saw it go by on the chat.
Oh, great.
Great. And I see someone who's working on a UDL study and is planning to use them. Excellent. Thank you all. This was great.
Yep. And I see over here on Twitter, Ron is looking to share the reporting criteria, and he has a link to a UDL reporting.
Thank you, Ron, if you're still with us. All right.
Oh, and Ruby, to answer your question, yes, this recording will be up on our YouTube channel and on the UDL IRN website tomorrow.
Oh, great. We have someone working on with a local school district to pilot UDL implementation. George, your people.
Excellent. I like that. Contact us if you want some support.
Yeah, George is the man for implementation.
He is.
Our district is.